All right, everybody. So I'm Chris Sprigman. I teach here at the law school. And to my right is Vijaya Gadde, the general counsel of Twitter. And first thing I want you to do, if you can, is join me in welcoming Vijaya to the law school. So I'm going to start with an audience question. Shout out if you think you know the answer. Who said this last week? I think that maybe I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Twitter. Correct. So my first question is, how does that make you feel?
This is like starting off in the hot seat.
It is, sorry.
Okay, great. I just want to know what I'm up for. Well, I think if I take a step back, which is what I often try to do when looking at the use of the platform, I look at what Twitter means in the world and what type of conversation it's enabled. And to me, there is nothing better than having a political discourse in plain and open view and having access to your elected officials and being able to hold them accountable. So in that sense, I think it's a great thing because this wasn't always possible before. The media often acted as a filter between ordinary citizens and elected officials, and now there's a direct dialogue. Now the consequences of that direct dialogue are unfolding in front of us, and not something that we could have quite predicted. But one of the reasons I went to work for Twitter was because it did provide this microphone for all citizens around the world to engage on issues that are important to them.
So I want to come back to these issues about Twitter's effect on our culture as a platform and its effect in invigorating speech. But I want to start a little bit more conventionally and just go back a bit to the year 2000, which is when you graduated from this law school. You're our alum. Welcome back. And also one of our trustees. Can you describe what path your career took when you left law school? And the thing I'm most interested in directly to start out is, what did you have in mind when you were in law school? Was it something specific or something more general than this?
So I was one of the people that came to law school because I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And a lot of that started from my childhood. So I'm going back even further. Sorry, I hope that's all right.
That's fine, we have time.
Started back even further. My aunt in India was one of the first lawyers in India, and that was always very inspiring to me. And then I grew up, my parents and I immigrated to this country in the 70s. I grew up in a small town in Texas on the Gulf Coast, near the border of Louisiana. It was a very challenging location for an immigrant family. And my parents went through quite a bit to be a part of that community. I've told this story before. I try not to get emotional, but it's a very hard story. My dad had a master's degree, but he couldn't find work. So he took a job at the time selling insurance door to door and collecting premiums door to door. And he wasn't even allowed to have that job until he went to the local leader of the KKK and asked permission, because his company and his boss feared for his safety as a person of color, walking around in white communities and knocking on doors. And my dad tells this story, but it was a very pragmatic, practical decision for him to have to do that. Right. He had no choice. He had to feed his family. And it's a real reminder to me, even in my life, of how far things have come and yet how far we still have to go in our society when it comes to these matters. So that feeling of growing up in that community and that powerlessness that came from that actually really made me want to go to law school. I always felt like being a lawyer, no one messes with you. It's not quite that simple, of course, I know, because people mess with us all the time. But it made me feel like I would have a little bit more control over what was going on and understand what was okay and what was not okay. So I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't know what kind. I thought about doing employment discrimination work. I thought about doing international, which is why I ultimately came to NYU. And then while I was here, I saw this amazing thing happening in Silicon Valley and all these companies that were creating all these products that were changing the world and impacting so many people. And I decided to intern at a firm in Silicon Valley, and it was a great experience for me. I spent some of my summer in Silicon Valley, some in New York, and some in London. And what I found was this just crazy difference in the type of people that I was working with. When I was in Silicon Valley, I would be sitting across the table from entrepreneurs that were my age who looked like me, who were building companies. And when I was in New York, I didn't have that same experience. In fact, I wasn't even really engaging with clients as much in New York and London. And so I wanted to go to Silicon Valley because I thought I would be taken more seriously. I would be working with people that were my age, and then I'd have more responsibility.
So just out of curiosity, you're in New York from time to time, and do you think that's still true, that the Valley is more open to people of diverse backgrounds and that there's more of a kind of startup mentality there, or have the places converged, or where do we stand now here in New York?
It's a great question. I would say in some places they've converged, but the Valley has a long way to go. And I think a lot of the ideals by which technology companies were founded we have a lot to live up to those ideals. Certainly certain classes of immigrants have done very well there, but we've also left behind a lot of people in Silicon Valley, and we have also focused on only certain aspects of our society, and we have not done a great job of making sure technology is accessible to everyone, no matter what income bracket, and focuses on the needs of everyone.
So I want to come back to the Valley's culture as well, but I want to trace your career. So you leave New York, you go to the Valley, you're working at a law firm. What kind of stuff were you doing, and what did you have in mind? So there's a thing that I think a lot of students experience. When they're in school, they don't know much about law firms. When they're in law firms, they don't know much about how to leave them. So I'd be very interested in what your thinking was while you were there, how you guided your career, and how intentional you were about what you wanted.
It would be great for me to sit here and tell you guys I was really intentional. It never worked out like that. I went to a law firm primarily because it was the easiest path available to me and because I had a lot of debt and I needed to pay it off. I always had a plan that I would pay off my loans and get out as soon as possible and do something I really loved. Right. And then about 4 years in, I was like, I can't get a job doing anything else quite yet. I had a great experience at a law firm. It was very good training, but I always kind of knew that it wasn't for me and it wasn't something I wanted to do long term. And yet I ended up there for almost nine and a half years. And ultimately, I decided to leave. And I had been looking for jobs all along, but ultimately I decided to leave because it was 2009. The economy was crashing all around us. I practiced corporate law, so I was doing IPOs, mergers and acquisitions, securities work. The market crashing, I had no work to do, and I was up for partner that year, and I didn't make partner. And I had a real moment of reckoning, and I was like, well, why am I trying so hard to do something that I'm not even sure that I want to do? Right. And I quit my job. And a lot of people, many of the partners I worked with thought I was crazy. They were like, just wait one more year, things will recover, we'll get you in here. And I was like, but I'm not sure that that's what I want to do. So I quit and I took 6 months off and I traveled around the world. And it was during kind of that same period of time that I started becoming aware of Twitter as a platform.
And so what was your first introduction to the company? How did you get to know them?
So I first heard of Twitter I'd heard of it, but the reason I started paying attention to it in 2009 was I had a close friend that I worked with at Wilson Sonsini. His name was Alexander McGilvery, brilliant lawyer. He had gone to Google, was one of the architects of the book search deal, just a brilliant legal mind. And Alex left Google to go become the first general counsel of Twitter. And I was like, oh, well, if Alex is leaving, I should be paying more attention to this company. And around the same time, something really strange happened. My father-in-law, who's Egyptian, started using Twitter. And he lives in Cairo. And he started tweeting about all the things going on in Egypt, including, his moments in Tahrir Square and what was going on. And it was this really eye-opening moment for me to be able to experience his world on a platform. And I was like, this is amazing. I can't imagine what else could be done, and I want to go work for this company.
So did you become a Twitter user about this time?
Yes, 2009.
So how did you get an entree to the company? What was did you call up AMAC and?
Yeah, so I called up AMAC and I was like, I want to come work for you. And he said, I don't need a corporate lawyer, we're a private company. And I was like, great. So I was like, but you're gonna need one day, so keep me in mind. And I kept that relation, we were friends, so I just kept harassing him every couple of months. And in the meantime, I needed to get a job so I could pay my bills. I had had some great clients while I was at Wilson, reached out to a bunch of them, and ended up going to Juniper Networks, which is a networking company, for about 6 months. About 6 months into that job, where I was leading the corporate team there, AMAC calls and says, guess what? I need a corporate lawyer. It was like, it would have been a lot easier if we could have just figured this out 6 months ago. So I went and interviewed, and I never looked back. I went to Twitter to originally lead our corporate team, get us ready for an IPO, lead the acquisitions we were doing at the time. They were small, but we were doing about 10 to 20 a year, so it was a fair amount of work, and all the financings that we were doing before we were going public.
So you stayed at the company, you rose to general counsel. You said earlier you were interested when you got to law school in employment law and international law. I'm betting that you do both now as general counsel, or that you at least are supervising people who do both of those things. Tell us a little bit about what your life is like as a general counsel, what kind of law you're practicing, and how much of your daily life is law versus management, maybe even what's your best and what's your worst aspect of the job.
Got it. Okay. Well, I can honestly say as a general counsel, no day looks the same, especially at a company like Twitter. So much of what's happening in the world can be reflected in what we're dealing with on the legal team. And so every day can be different. We could be, I've literally gotten calls in the middle of the night because we're getting a tax raid in a particular country, or because we've been blocked by a country because we refuse to take content down. So there is a little bit of like, you have to be prepared for whatever might come. And I actually have found that the longer I've been in this role, and I've been general counsel for almost 4 years, I don't really feel like a lawyer anymore. I still advise on legal issues, but it's more that I have a lot of experts that work on my team who are at the top of their field, and they give like the strong legal advice, and I help translate that legal advice to how we should be running the business.
So it's a strategy job.
Yes, yes.
So what is it about you as a person, or about your training, or about your employment experience that gave you the qualities to do this job, which sounds more like statesmanship than lawyering?
I wish I could say I could point to one thing. I really can't. What I'll say is working at a firm for a really long time gave me a very broad experience with a lot of different companies. I saw companies go through all sorts of transitions, whether it was private to public, or how to get your first round of financing, how to get acquired, how to acquire another company, integrate it. So I saw a lot of companies go through these big periods in their lives. I helped advise them through those. And then I also just paid a lot of attention once I got to Twitter, and I learned a lot. And I had really great bosses who gave me the chance to grow into the role. I can honestly say there's no one that felt more unqualified upon taking a GC role than I did when I got into Twitter. I was horrified. I was like, oh my God, they trust me to do this job. It was a very scary moment because I had never done this job before. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what it would take. And I had really supportive people, both in terms of the people I worked for, my board of directors, as well as my team who was there to help me, because I couldn't be an expert in everything. I was a corporate lawyer for 12 years, and then I was expected to be able to advise on employment issues, international law issues, free speech issues, content issues, copyright issues, patent issues. I didn't even know most of those areas in any detail.
So it's funny that you say that you felt, in a sense, unqualified, right? So I would suspect that there are some men who wouldn't say that, right? So that there's a sense of arriving at some place important, doing an important job, being a person who's out in front of a company that a lot of people are paying attention to, that can be intimidating. How has it changed you? If you could think of a way in which you as a person are different now than you were then, what would it be?
I think I have a lot more confidence now that I can figure it out and that nobody really knows the answers going in. And I think one of the great things about being on a leadership team is you have great resources around you, and you realize that there's a little bit of everyone figuring it out as they go. And no matter how confident and how secure people might look, you don't know the answers to all these questions. If it were easy, everyone would have done it by now. And a lot of times, it is a matter of doing your best. You're not always going to be right, but being thoughtful, being careful, being dedicated, and doing your best is going to get you most of the way there.
So there's a issue this month for The Atlantic, which has a cover story that's titled, "Why is Silicon Valley so awful for women?" I'm interested in your thoughts on whether that's an accurate portrayal. Obviously, it's shorthand for something.
Yeah.
And if it is at all accurate, if it's even in part accurate, what's at the root of the problem?
So I will say that I know the experience of many women and underrepresented minorities. I don't want to leave out that group because I think diversity often focuses on gender, and I think it needs to be a much broader focus. And it's another area where Silicon Valley has a long way to go. I think many people's experience can be a negative one. And I don't come from the technical world. I was not an engineer. So I don't have the same experience, and a lot of the experiences that have been very public, and I don't know if everyone's been paying attention to some of the stories that have come out of Uber and other companies recently, have often come from a world where there are a couple of women who are the only women on a very large team that is predominantly male. That's not my experience in Silicon Valley. The G&A side of most of these companies has a little bit better gender balance. And so my experience is a different one, but I also am very aware that my experience is not typical.
Right.
And so I don't know I can't comment on how prevalent it is. It is an issue. It's one that needs to be addressed. And I have some speculations, which I'm happy to share with you about the root cause of it. I think that there are bad actors, certainly. I think the root cause is a couple of things. One, you really need to care about these issues to make a difference. And I think for so long in technology, it was always about the product. It was always about pushing something out. It was always about the next iteration. And how people got there didn't matter as much as getting the great product out. And so the overwhelming focus on results versus how they got there, and that's tone from the top. That's leadership. That's people caring about diversity in a fundamental way. And making the very hard choices that you would need to make a change within your culture and your organization.
So do you think at all that your gender has shaped the way that you handle issues at Twitter? Is there something about your leadership style or something about your way of advising your client that is related to your gender?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't. I'd like to think that I listen well, that I communicate clearly, but I know plenty of men who have that skill too, so I don't know the answer to that question. I think I've seen great GCs of both genders, so I don't think you have to be one or the other.
Let me let you mull it a bit by asking you a question on another issue that's pretty hot these days, and that's immigration.
Mm-hmm.
So the tech industry, it seems to me, from this other coast and this vantage point outside of the industry itself, has come out pretty firmly and with, frankly, unexpected unity against some of the recent immigration law and policy changes. What's driving that? And is there something special about the role of immigrants in the Valley's economy that makes that response understandable?
Yes. So there's no doubt that in some ways, speaking out against the recent immigration orders was pretty unified and pretty quick and swift and unflinching. And I was really proud of the industry for doing that. And it is rare for us to agree that wholeheartedly, but I do think one of the things that we can all agree is that there are many great immigrants who came to America and helped build some of the great iconic American tech companies. And that's true today. So many of the CEOs, whether it's Microsoft or Google, are immigrants. But it wasn't just that. It was also this sense of unfairness, particularly in the First Order, which gave no notice and caused so much disruption and harm to people's lives all around the world. And I mean, of course, from the legal side, we wrote amicus briefs because we believe both those orders are unconstitutional for various reasons. But it was the unfairness of it. It just didn't feel that there was a rational policy basis and that it was going to harm American business interests and harm American companies as well, and American families. And you know, the great promise of the internet and computing and technology is to break boundaries and bring the world closer together. And something like this is like the counter to that.
Right.
And it really hurts, and it starts creating walls and creating boundaries where none should really exist.
There's also this odd phenomenon that's occurred to me, and I mentioned something like this to my copyright class this morning. You know, so the US controls so much of the internet's infrastructure, right? So the major social networking platforms, for example, like Twitter, are US based. And there's part of the legitimacy of that, I think, may come from the fact that, you know, we're open to outsiders, and outsiders from this country, immigrants to this country, have been so important in Silicon Valley's history and in these particular companies that have, you know, pushed themselves out into the world and brought a lot of change to the world. You know, it's flowing both ways, and that's part of what I think makes the US-centric nature of so much US internet infrastructure tolerable, possibly. So are you worried, if we go down this road, that this will affect companies like Twitter and their ability to find acceptance around the world?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We will see the backlash of this in many different ways, whether it's heightened regulations against American companies. And it's not just this. I mean, if you look back, going back to Edward Snowden and the leaks that he revealed about, you know, NSA's ability to potentially, allegedly, directly access information about users from around the world of all these tech companies. That significantly affected our ability
Right.
to do business, because it is really hard to convince a foreign government that, you know, you need a law enforcement warrant or you need proper court orders in order to get this information, when they are convinced that the US government just has a backdoor to everything that you own.
So that, you mentioned Snowden, and you mentioned this problem of how we can manage surveillance. And it seems, again, from an outside perspective, that Twitter has offered somewhat firmer resistance versus some other tech companies to government information demands. So is that the case? And if so, why is that the case?
I don't know if it's the case universally. I think there are some other companies that are doing great work in this space, including Google. And in fact, Google was one of the trendsetters in creating this concept of a transparency report, which is a biannual report that a lot of tech companies, over 60 now,
Right.
publish, that details all the requests that they are getting from governments around the world, either to take content down or to hand over information about
And
the
your latest
users.
one's just out this morning, I see.
Yesterday, yes,
Yesterday,
exactly.
okay.
Yeah, so we published our latest one. And I think we have taken that a strong position here, partly because it's very core to the mission of what Twitter's doing. We've always held political speech to be very dear to the platform. One of the most important functions that we provide as a service around the world is this ability to speak freely and pseudonymously, if you need to, in certain parts of the world. And so protecting the anonymity of those users and you know, protecting the content, where in a lot of places that content would not be welcome, but they're important political issues. That's a core to who we are as a product. And so our legal policy on these issues is also very much aligned to that, in that we will take extra scrutiny in evaluating all the orders we receive. We will challenge many of the orders we receive. And we will fight back. That is what we've always been known for.
So what's the rule, if you can articulate it, or the principle that you apply when you decide whether to simply push for clarification, or whether to accede to an order, or whether to fight? So what's the decision tree look like?
It's a really complicated one. There's a
Yeah.
big spreadsheet, but what I'll simplify it to is we always look for proper process, which means you can't take shortcuts. You can't be like, I'm sorry, I couldn't get the court order.
Yeah.
Can you give us this information? Or it can't look like a sham, meaning there will be times where someone will come to us and say, we need this information because this is a threat to someone's life. We will actually look at the tweets and be like, this is not a threat to someone's life. Like, you want this because this is political speech and not because this is something else going on. So those are the types of situations where we'll push back. Or what we've noticed more recently is much more targeting of journalists and an attempt to either take down their content or identify who they might be speaking to in cases of confidential sources. So we will look through and we will actually look at what they're trying to get and make sure that we believe that the law of that country actually applies in this situation. And even when it does, we will also push back in some cases and just disagree. We've seen this a lot, particularly in Turkey, recent crackdowns against journalists. We challenge the vast majority of orders that we receive there because we just don't believe, even under Turkish law, that they are valid, but we have lost almost all those cases.
What's going on in Turkey? So you guys were actually, I don't know what the term would be, taken down in Turkey for a period of time?
We were blocked, yeah.
So what happened there, and why are you guys such a hot button issue in Turkey?
If you could explain what's going on
Yeah.
in Turkey, that would be great. But a lot of changes, under their current regime, and a lot of political changes in their government as well. And certainly they had a coup attempt, and post-coup, dismantling of a lot of their democratic institutions. So it's been a challenging market. We were blocked because we were refusing to take down content, which in my view was alleging political corruption at the highest levels of government, and we felt that it was really important that Turkish people have access to that information. We had a lot of support in that case from civil societies and journalists at the time. This was about 3 years ago. We filed a case, or actually it wasn't our case. We filed a case, but also the local Turkish civil society filed a case in their constitutional courts, and their constitutional Supreme Court overruled the Turkish ban and said that we were an important platform for free expression, and this constituted free expression, and we've been up since then, but it is a tough market for these types of issues.
And you guys are not in China, right?
No,
so
we are not in China.
Some other tech companies are in China, some other social networking platforms are in China, so why are you not in China?
Not many American ones are, though.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. We've always taken the position that we are unwilling to do the types of things that we would need to do to be unblocked in China. That includes local storage of user information, active censorship of anything political, and easy access for the government for user data. And those are conditions which we just don't believe would serve our mission in the world.
You mentioned local storage of user information. Is this something on the agenda of other countries that want you not to keep data in the US where it's hard to get to, but they want you to keep data local? Is this something you're asked or requested to do a lot?
Yeah, data localization is, I think, going to be one of the next big challenges for American tech companies, not just from a expense point of view, but a feasibility point of view. And yeah, it is a law that's been either passed or about to be passed in a fair number of countries, and it's unclear how it's going to affect American tech companies.
Yeah, because to some degree, when we export American social media platforms, we're also exporting American privacy expectations, right? And not completely, but on a practical level, it's harder to get to information when it's residing on a server in California than when it's residing on a server, just to pick one country, Vladivostok. I'd be interested to know what you think the prospects are for these data localization initiatives. I know that there's a block of countries in the UN who are actually pushing for these rules.
So it's funny, I don't think it's just about American privacy restrictions, because if you think about it that way, Europeans actually have stronger privacy restrictions.
Absolutely.
And they want the data stored there because they don't want to be subject to the rather lax rules that apply in the United States. So it's different in different places. I think it's a couple of things that are driving this largely. One is the access to the data in the US has just been more difficult because the same laws don't apply. The US government has court orders, warrants, subpoenas that they can issue on us. A foreign country will often be relying on treaties between the US and other governments, which take a lot longer, including the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but often takes a country maybe over 6 months to get access to information.
And in the current Justice Department, it could be 6 years.
It could be. I actually don't know the current numbers or the current wait time. So I think there's got to be some reform there, and I think actually tech companies are very supportive of reform there because it is important, and we're not deliberately trying to withhold, but we exist within the laws that are currently on the books, and this is how we hand over information about our users.
So I just want to ask a couple of kind of process questions about surveillance. So you are restricted from telling the public about the details of information requests that you've received from the US government. Can you describe a bit what these restrictions are and whether you think they're consistent with what you would view to be responsible disclosure? So you give us these transparency reports. They tell us the number of requests that you get. They tell us the number of user accounts they're directed against. They give us some sense of the growth or shrinkage of these requests over time. But that's about it, right? So what would you like to disclose if you could?
So our typical process, and the process a lot of tech companies would take, is if you get a request from a government to either take the content down or to turn over information about you, including your email address, your phone number, who you are if we know it, your IP address, your location, is to provide the user notice. And we would send an email and we would say, hey, person in XYZ place, you should know that a government has issued us a warrant for your content or issued us a subpoena to provide this information. If you want to challenge this information, you now, as you have the notice and you're able to do so. And we think that that's a good and appropriate way to handle this because we can't challenge every single subpoena or warrant. We do try to challenge a lot, but we can't do every one. So in a lot of cases, that order for information will be served with a gag order. And some of these are pretty standard, like it's a high-profile criminal investigation. They don't want to tip off the person. I understand. Some of the gag orders are absolutely legitimate. And we will generally work with a district attorney or another law enforcement agency to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of time on the gag order so it's not indefinite, so you never find out or you're never able to provide this notice. And in some cases, even with the FBI, a lot of the orders they give us will not be either with a gag order or an indefinite gag order. Mm-hmm. However, they do have the capability under a lot of laws to issue either national security letter requests, which we would not be able to talk about the existence of. Right. I can now tell you we've received a few because I've finally been authorized to disclose them. If I had told you that a couple months ago, I could have gone to jail, which sounds crazy. And under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act as well, orders under 702 of that act. And again, I can't tell you whether I've received any of them because to even tell you that I have or have not gotten them would be an illegal act.
You can tell me, actually. I'm exempted from the statute. But so this was surprising to me because recently you shared redacted versions of 2 national security letters you'd received from the FBI. And the first question that popped into my mind is, how did that happen, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about why you were able to share more details in these instances than typically?
So there's been a lot of litigation from many companies on national security letters in particular. And so when Congress passed the USA Freedom Act in 2015, they added a provision that basically said that the FBI needs to review all indefinite gag orders on national security letters that they issue and review them from time to time to make sure that the length of the gag order is appropriate. And so as part of that process, and as part of that statute, they also allowed companies to ask questions about certain ones and make sure that they're not indefinite. So a couple of months ago, the FBI notified us, or the DOJ, that they lifted the gag order on 2 NSLs, and then we requested some other ones, and those came through as well. So I think we've published that 5 of them have now been unsealed, and we've provided redacted versions of that order to the users in question. So for the first time, many, many years after the fact, these individuals now know that the government was asking for this information.
Anything surprising, or that should be surprising to us when we look at these?
I don't think so.
Okay. So they're just representative. There's nothing special about these.
I don't think so.
Okay. So I want to talk a bit, if you would, about how Twitter users treat one another. So in 2015, you published an op-ed in the Washington Post. And you talked in that op-ed about some of the abuse that goes on online, some of which goes on Twitter. And you detailed a decision to tighten Twitter's protections against abuse. So can you talk a little bit about what provoked you into that decision? And then also a little bit about what the tightening was. So what changed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think just to give you all a little bit of a framework of how Twitter started, there was this notion that we would be a platform for all voices and that we would try to be as objective as possible and not intervene in disputes or conversations between individuals and accounts.
Right.
And we had this very, I would say, lofty ideal that Twitter was a reflection of the world, which I actually do believe, but that we shouldn't intervene, and the only guide that should really be our guide when we do intervene is the law. So if the law tells us something's illegal, or if the law tells us something is illegal content or illegal behavior, or the government comes and tells us it is, then we will act and take that down or intervene. So that's how we started. And so our policies were quite liberal, quite open. It had to be a direct threat of violence.
Right.
You know, and we didn't, we used US norms actually to guide us a lot because we were a US company, and at the time we started, we had largely US users. Now, if you fast forward to, I guess that was in 2015,
yeah.
Global company, 80% of our users outside the United States, and what we had found was that philosophy just wasn't working. And I came to that conclusion not just on our own, but because our users were telling us this wasn't working, and had spent a lot of time with both victims of online abuse and advocates for those victims, talking about how this is such a powerful platform and it is being used in ways to ruin people's lives. And it is not just the internet, it is people's lives and livelihoods that are being impacted by this. And so we really did a lot of soul searching, and we decided to do a big revamp of a bunch of our rules, and we added, you know, a bunch of people to help review and expedite our reports, and we still didn't get it right. So that was 2015, and we were taking a policy and human approach to dealing with abuse on the platform. And so if you fast forward now to 2017, we've actually completely thrown all of that out. We kept the rules and the updates, but we are a tech company and we need to have technological solutions to these problems. So we are rethinking our approach here completely. We're providing a lot more controls to people to control the experience, but we're also taking a lot of that burden that we put on users to police the platform, and we're taking it back on ourselves to identify this content.
So I'm going to talk about some specifics. So for example, you talked about direct threats, and in the beginning, your willingness to remove a tweet was really limited to direct threats, like, I'm going to kill you.
Yep.
Okay. And then there are indirect threats, and there's an absolutely notorious indirect threat example from Twitter, which was the rape train is coming. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's not a direct threat of what I'm going to do to you, but it's certainly a threat. Okay, so that under your new guidelines counts as
It would be abusive. It would come down. Yeah.
So there's other tools on Twitter that have been added. So, for example, I've noticed it's become easier in the last year and a half or so to mute people, right? It's also become easier, if I understand what I've been looking at correctly, to share lists of blocked users.
That's
so
right.
In other words, if you're a journalist and there's a bunch of trolls who are in the business of threatening or harassing journalists, maybe one journalist compiles a list of these people and can share it with other journalists, and you get this information spread widely. Anything else?
On the rules side, the other big change we made last year was to actually roll out this notion of hateful conduct being banned, which is targeting abuse against a group of people because of their status and participation as a protected class. And that was another area where we had never really been specific.
So can you give me an example of that behavior?
Sure, of course. I mean, what we saw last year, we saw a lot of targeting of anti-Semitic content,
Right.
and they would be violent graphic images from World War II targeting, as an example, a Jewish journalist. Those are the types of things that we are now very, very specific are prohibited. And it's not, it's religion, it's gender, it's a whole host of categories which we typically think of as protected categories.
So let me ask you about a relatively hot button case that I'm wondering where it falls into this category. So Milo Yiannopoulos, he orchestrated the abuse of Leslie Jones, I think it's fair to say. But he maintains that he was banned for speech. So what's your construction of why Milo Yiannopoulos lost his Twitter card?
Milo continued repeatedly to violate the Twitter rules, and after being warned, he was suspended according to our policies. How many of you guys are familiar with Milo? Has he been invited to speak on this campus?
Not by me.
Okay.
I mean, I don't like his taste in neckties. And so there's a number of things about him that would deter me from inviting him.
So Milo was on the platform for many years, and there are many of Milo's associates who are also currently on the platform. And I appreciate and understand why people will claim bias in our decisions. We try very hard not to be biased. I will say this, if I wanted, or my team or our company really wanted to target and censor certain types of speech based on their content, we would do a much better job than we are today.
You know, this is the thing about censors. So I know you are saying this as a counterfactual because you're not going to do this. But so my brother was posted to Iraq for 2 tours, and I had communications with him that frankly surprised me in terms of their detail. Censorship never seems to reach these things. You know, it always seems like kind of haphazard, right? Maybe there's some government somewhere that does this systematically and well, but you know, maybe this is a warning to would-be censors. It's actually really difficult. It's actually difficult, I think, to do.
It is difficult to do, but China does a remarkably good job of it.
Up to a point.
Up to a point, yes.
Yeah, so, okay. I'm going to talk a bit about anonymous accounts. So you mentioned them earlier, anonymous accounts, and you allow them, right? So, and the obvious upside is, in a lot of places, if you're gay in Saudi Arabia, for example, and you want to talk about gay life in a city in Saudi Arabia, it's helpful to remain anonymous.
Or a woman.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about anything really that's controversial or of a political issue, and we do see a lot of women on the platform in Saudi Arabia, which is great, and one of our largest growing markets, which is also great.
So the downside is there are a lot of people who probably, if they had to identify themselves in some way, would not be hateful, but behind a mask of anonymity, they will be hateful, right? So they're willing to be hateful anonymously. So, you know, there's both sides. So I would love to have your thoughts on the trade-off and how we should think about that trade-off.
It is a hard trade-off, and what I would say is we made that decision a long time ago, stand by the decision to allow this type of speech on the platform, but what we didn't do was invest in the tools or the resources to fight the other side of it, which was using anonymous accounts to troll and harass people. And so we have done a much different job over the last couple of years. We've invested in technologies to find repeat offenders. So if you've been suspended from the platform and you come back, we actually have some capabilities on the technological side to detect that and stop you from doing that, which has been one of our big problems is these sock puppet accounts, these anonymous accounts. The second thing that we've done is actually taken a gradient approach to how we think about this. So you can be anonymous on the platform, but if you start exhibiting certain behaviors, then we will ask you to verify your email address or verify your phone number. And we do find that it is a high burden to get a new phone to use Twitter. So that's a line that most people don't want to cross.
Right.
And so we are taking a little bit more aggressive stand to collect that information.
So that's very interesting because that got to something that had occurred to me when I thought about anonymity as this kind of great blessing but also somewhat of a burden. Was there ever any thought given to using a depository? So anonymous accounts would be available on Twitter if you deposited verifiable information with a third party that is actually immune to process from Twitter, right, but maybe subject to process elsewhere, the same way you are from governments. Was there any thought given to that?
Not so much that, but we did talk about at one point, if we were to think about not allowing anonymous accounts, is there a way that we could still work with activists around the world where we could get them like more of a whitelist approach to anonymous accounts through trusted third parties, whether they're groups on the ground or groups like ACLU or Reporters Without Borders or someone who could kind of be the verified, like this person needs an anonymous account. We did have those conversations. It is a much more complicated thing, as you can imagine,
Yeah.
to like hand out anonymous accounts. So we're still working within this framework of trying to allow it, but be much more controlling of the circumstances in which you can keep it.
Yeah, because then if you whitelist, only then potentially the connected get anonymous accounts. And often the people who need them the most are the ones who are just not connected,
Right.
And the point of Twitter is to connect them. So it's a bit of a puzzle.
And I think that you lose your advantage once you collect the information from these people, period. It doesn't matter whether we collect it or someone else collects it. Once it's collected somewhere, they can be tracked.
So can I come full circle back in a kind of glancing way to Donald Trump? And what I'm interested in is bots and trolls, right? So there are reports, and I don't know how credible these are, but that Russia and Russian interests funded groups of pro-Trump Twitter trolls. And personally, I have had the experience of tweeting something about Donald Trump and having a bunch of accounts associated with an egg, essentially, tweet back at me something like, "You're a Jew," okay, or something similar.
Yeah.
Which, there it is. So it's probably some Macedonian kid. He's like 13, but it's possible. So what have you learned about these set of allegations, and what, if anything, do you think Twitter's approach might be in future election seasons if something like this were to recur?
Yeah, and we're actually seeing this. I mean, obviously not a U.S. election, but there are elections going on around the world. So something that we're looking into. Just as a step back, I would say bots themselves are not prohibited on Twitter. You can create a bot. They're very useful bots, weather bots, train schedule bots.
Some bots can be very funny.
Some bots are hilarious.
Yes.
So it's not that bots are in and of themselves a problem. The
Right.
problem is when you're doing coordinated campaigns that are more about spamming people, malware, misinformation, that type of thing. So we've definitely increased the resources that we're committed to finding that. Hopefully you've seen a little bit of a difference in that, in your experience so far. But I think that the bigger problem in general on the internet is not just the bots, but it's the information and the spread of information
Right.
that may or may not be accurate.
Right, so there's all this low quality information that trolls and bots, and I mean trolls and bots, one thing, but also just dopes are spreading around, right? Low quality information about political actors, low quality information about just private citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is not just Twitter. This is just generally a problem. Twitter happens to be part of the way in which this information gets spread. Facebook has mounted some kind of a response, right? So there's going to be some editorial action by Facebook. Occasionally they're going to flag a story, and I just saw a recent story flagged as basically multiple sources question the veracity of this story.
Right.
So the way Facebook is architected, that makes some sense, although it's unclear whether they could keep up with the flood, right? So is there something underway that's like that with you guys?
I mean, we're thinking through a number of options. What I would say is our platform is fundamentally different than Facebook. For the most part, a user on Twitter is choosing the accounts that they want to follow, right? They're choosing the information and the sources and the quality of the sources. We're not pushing information to them in terms of articles or the like. So you have a lot more control over what you're seeing and the trustworthiness of that. And secondly, it's an open platform. So anytime someone tweets, people are responding in real time, including journalists, because it's one of the primary tools that a journalist uses to debunk information. And we think that real-time open platform actually allows that corrective information. It does allow misinformation to spread at times, but it also allows quick corrective information.
It's kind of interesting. So the corrective information, so there are a number of scholars who make roughly a similar point, which is Americans are increasingly living in an ideological bubble. Like not everybody, but a lot of people. You're on Facebook and most of your friends basically think the way you do, so most of your news feed is basically reflecting your own beliefs. You're on Twitter, and so you follow certain people on Twitter. Unless you're an unusually curious person, the people you follow on Twitter are typically people like you, and so again, your Twitter feed looks like you, right? in that environment, which is definitely unlike the environment of newspapers, right? Back in the day when newspapers were vibrant and competitive and there were lots of points of view, can the truth beat lies?
It's hard. I think filter bubbles are a real problem across the internet. We're thinking through a bunch of things on the product side to combat that. But it's certainly not easy. We do have a part of our app that is about discovery. And in that part of it, we try to present multiple sides. And we have a product called Moments, which is a compilation of tweets about a particular topic. And our guidelines are public for anyone to see on our website. But one of the aspects of our guidelines is to present both sides of the story.
There's
and
also
tweets from
something
both
odd
sides.
going on in the press, which is you'll see news articles now that are about an issue. So I'll give you the most prosaic possible issue. So Topshop recently marketed some jeans, mom jeans, with a plastic plexi cutout in the knee so that you could see the wearer's knees. These are horrific, and lots of people tweeted about how horrific they were, and so there was a news article about the Twitter controversy over these jeans, right? So it's bootstrapping something that happens on Twitter into a news story, and sometimes when news stories do something like this, they try to collect a variety of different perspectives and present it, right? So this is also something that's happening kind of on top of Twitter
Yes.
as a second stage. So is there anything you guys do to encourage that or guide it?
Encourage the conversation on top of it.
Yeah.
Well, we obviously have a PR team and a media team that focuses on relationships with journalists. So if we see something on the platform, we'll try to pitch it to journalists so they get
Right.
the story. But I think Twitter memes are one of the best things
Yeah.
about the platform. Like these crazy things that just take off that you would never expect. And gosh, there are just so many great ones recently too in politics.
For
But
sure.
I'm just going to leave that where it is.
Yeah, no, there are. I'm thinking of a dog sitting in a burning room
Yeah.
right now. Okay, so maybe a last question before we open this up to the audience. When you think ahead over the next decade, what do you want Twitter to be? What do you want it to be to our society?
I think we already see the sparks of it, but I want it to be the place where everyone can go find out what's happening in their world. And that can be their local community, it can be the world at large. And I want it to be much more tailored to the things that you want to know. And I feel like we talk about Twitter as a big fire hose of information right now.
Right.
It's almost too much information unless you're willing to put a lot of work into curating it. And I would like it to see a much more tailored and sophisticated experience that gets you the information you want to see when you want to see it.
So that's interesting because there's two things happening there which I think maybe are congruent but maybe point in different directions. So the thing about Twitter that I really love is that it is kind of a fire hose. And I specifically construct my feed to try to get interesting thoughts from various types of perspectives just because I do that for a living. And so if I just hear people who are like myself, I'm going to be bad at what I do or worse at what I do. So that's a lovely inbuilt capacity in Twitter. So if Twitter was about what I want, it might be better for Twitter in the sense that you guys might have more of a marketing opportunity because you're giving me more of what I want. But it may be worse for society, right? Twitter may be less of a democratic institution than it actually is. Is that a tension that you guys are dealing with as you move forward?
I guess I don't view it entirely that way. I see what you're saying. I don't ever want to lose kind of the flood of everything interesting in the world.
Right.
But I do think that when I am on Twitter wanting to know what's going on in basketball, I just want to see what's going on in basketball, and I don't
Right.
want every other tweet to be about Trump. So being able to more curate the experience when
Right.
you want it, not to lose the other stuff, but at those moments where you're looking for something specific, providing that specific thing you're looking for and not having to wade through the full timeline in order to get those moments.
All right, so I'm totally sold because what that means for me is New York Mets Twitter.
Yes.
And that's
Sports
probably
Twitter's
worth
great
having.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to open this up to questions, and please, when you ask a question, wait to receive the microphone so that we can hear everybody. Michael, do you want to select people?
So Twitter has gone through a lot of high-profile leadership changes in the past few years. I'm wondering who is driving product strategy at Twitter, and what is legal's role in that?
It's a great question. I would say that our CEO, Jack Dorsey, and co-founder and creator of the product, is helping drive that along with some very talented people in our product team. As far as the legal influence of that, I guess there's a couple of areas where we give advice and feedback. One will be around privacy and security and making sure that to the extent that we're collecting information about our users, that we're using it in ways that are appropriate, that we're providing the right level of transparency, and that we're keeping that information secure. That's an area where we get very much involved, so data collection. And the other area is around the policies around the platform, like how is this going to impact our efforts to combat abuse on the platform? Is it going to create a new mechanism that we need to worry about? And is there mitigating things that we can put into place around that? So those are the main ways I would say we give a lot of feedback, and then just the actual legal day-to-day compliance aspects of the product.
Great, we have another question here, Max.
Hi, thanks for being here. At the beginning, you mentioned that you want to see Twitter as like a tool for democratic discourse. Well, of course, now with the political events in the last year, you mentioned Trump, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, also used it for inflammatory comments very often. I was reminded or thought a little bit about the first debate of Kennedy and Nixon, where a lot of people who just listened to it thought Nixon did a better job, but who watched the TV interview actually thought that Kennedy would come across much better. So I was wondering if you were advising people who want to have a real political discourse and not just slander people in 130 signs, what would you recommend, or what would you tell them how they can compete with the people who abuse Twitter in a certain way? Because it will always be easier to slander someone than to make a valid political argument.
Yeah, and here's what I would say. I think Twitter is not to be the sole tool for political diplomacy or political discourse. It can't be. It's 140 characters. You should not be driving an entire policy agenda or an entire administration on one place. Can't be happening. And so we do work with governments around the world to give them best practices. This is about reaching to your constituents, gathering information, asking questions. It is a tool to supplement. It is not a tool that's going to take away everything. And so I think it's used best when in that light. It is really a way to speak directly to your citizens and get feedback from your citizens.
You know, when it comes to policy too, there's something on Twitter I've noticed, and something I really admire about Twitter, which is, so I'm really interested in subways. And in New York, there's a blogger.
Train, not the restaurant.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm really not interested in the restaurant. I'm really interested in the subway. And there's a blogger in New York. He writes a blog called Second Avenue Sagas about the Second Avenue subway, and he has a Twitter feed. And he knows everything about the subways. He's a thorn in the side of the MTA, and he uses Twitter very much to his advantage to affect the policy debate on transportation in New York City, because he laser focuses on this thing. He knows really a lot about it, and he's become, I think, very widely followed and influential. That kind of policy-related substantive debate can be driven by someone who beforehand had no reach.
Right, and it also gives people like that, or people in other communities, you know, the pipeline protests. It gives visibility into things that are happening that are policy issues. But it's not going to be everything. It's not going to replace long-form journalism. It's not going to replace all aspects. So I think of it as a supplementary and vital tool, but not an exclusive one.
Hi there. Thanks for the great talk. I guess a little tangent of the whole democratic debate. As you say, Twitter is supposed to be a place where everyone can go to find out what's going on in the world, right? I was wondering, what's Twitter's answer to situations where in countries, so to say, or states that deliberately suppress that freedom of expression? Say, for example, where I'm from in Uganda, during an election period last year, everything was shut out. So it felt like the only place we could find out what's going on was shut down. That's social media, WhatsApp, and all that. So what's your answer to these things? And technologically speaking, let's assume you have the ability to stick it to them and say, we're going to have a Twitter accessible via VPN, you can shut us down. And is that plausible? And if so, how willing are companies like Twitter and Google to go ahead and really stick it to them, knowing very well there's serious business consequences to that?
Yeah, and look, I think you're reflecting on a really hard thing. There are a lot of parts of the world where the internet infrastructure is completely controlled by governments. The ISPs are controlled by governments, and so when the government decides in the wake of an election or following a coup that they are going to instruct all of their ISPs to shut off all social media, there's very little that we as a company can do. So there are a couple of things we have invested in that tend to make a difference. This happened in Egypt around the revolution. We still offer a product by SMS. So you can tweet and receive tweets by SMS, which is not used functionality that's not used very often, but it is critical in those types of moments. And we do that because of those moments. It's not otherwise.
Because then it makes the government, it's very costly for the government to shut down if they're going to shut down their messaging system as
Exactly. If they're going to shut down all phones, that's a very different thing from
Right.
Mobile phones. Because in a lot
Yeah.
of the developing countries, particularly, mobile
Those
phones
are
are what they
phones.
have,
Yeah.
not landlines. So that's one thing. And I would say we've also made business decisions like China, where we've said, yes, there are users in China who access us through a VPN, but we're not going to we're not going to go invest the resources to make money in that country, even though we think it's a very lucrative market, because we're unwilling to do the types of things that that government would require of us. So, and I think there are other companies out there that have a similar stance.
I mean, it's funny, back in the day, when the Soviets were our adversaries, we had Voice of America, and we funded it very generously, and we beamed radio signals into Voice of America into these countries, and that was something that they tried to jam, and we would try to counter their jamming, right? So we haven't done that with the internet. It's not like we have a fleet of satellites orbiting the Earth, beaming internet access into Uganda after the election.
I do think it will become harder and harder for these countries to do that, though. I mean, if you
Yeah.
think of where internet infrastructure is moving
Yeah.
and the technologies that are going to come, you can imagine a world that's digitally connected, that's outside the control of any one particular country. And so I think the real challenge will be then, and what companies are willing to do at that point.
We have time for one more?
So the question's about the balance between reflecting topics of discussion and culture in general versus shaping it. And I've come across literature where the discussion is how platforms have embedded politics in how they decide what's trending, and it's not just a technical issue, and how whatever these decisions are, once a topic gets above the threshold, then the effect is multiplied, and what is important is debatable anyway. So how does Twitter think about this issue, and what is the interplay between engineers and the legal team and the PR team to even figure out how to grapple with a topic like that?
Yeah, I think to start with is a really important acknowledgement within any company that even algorithms have bias. They just do. Because the people who built them have bias, because all human beings have bias. And so understanding that, like, even though we've tried to create as an objective as a system to highlight trends, for example, that we do have to at times intervene on a trend, either because it's a violation of our policy or because it was started by bots, and we don't want bots, for example, to be a trending topic, because that would be a bad way to create a trending topics list and create bad incentives. So I think we have an ongoing dialogue about those things when we notice something pop in that doesn't seem appropriate or somehow seems to have gotten there through some sort of bias. So we've had this issue recently in the last couple of months where certain search terms were pointing directly to certain individuals that weren't particularly flattering. We're like, where is this coming from? Like, what built the algorithm, what in the algorithm is highlighting this? And how are we, is this the right thing? Is this the right to do it this way, or should we be having a conversation? So we engage in those dialogues all the time. I would say not so much the legal side itself, because it's not necessarily a legal issue, but the other half of my team is a policy team that crafts the policies for the platform that are meant to be about building user trust. And so that team is actively engaged and working with all of our machine learning teams across the company to understand, like, what are the biases built in, like what are the false positives, are they acceptable level, like is this really appropriate in light of what we're trying to achieve.
Michael, do we have time for another? Okay, great.
I feel like you should get a prize for sitting in the front row.
I know, right?
So there you go.
So I was just curious to hear your views on remedies for online defamation, especially given now that with online speech, defamatory speech is easily accessible and tends to last forever. You don't have to go find the microform to see it, especially considering Hassel v. Bird in California, where Yelp as a non-party was ordered to take down speech that the court found to be defamatory, and Yelp fought it. So just based on what you said earlier, it seemed like that would be something that you would take down, maybe perhaps with a different policy from Yelp.
So our policy on defamation is to rely on court orders. So we generally don't get involved in, like, at least in the US, and trying to determine what is or isn't defamatory content, but we'll rely on a judgment by a court as to that. I'm not familiar with that specific case. I'm sure someone on my team is. But one of the challenges we face is that those laws are so different country to country. And in a lot of countries, it is, you start accruing liability from the minute that content appears on your platform once you get noticed, regardless of whether it's a court giving notice. So it puts a pretty big burden on our review teams to be able to flag that type of content. And quite frankly, we have, close to 500 million tweets a day. Like, it's almost impossible to keep up with it. So it's just one of those risks that we as a company live with on a day-to-day basis, and I don't really have a more specific answer than that.
Okay, so I want to bring this to a close. Please join me again in thanking Vijaya Gadde for coming to talk with us.